IVM.
When I was 10 years old, one morning, I was preparing to go to my abacus class. I lived in Chennai with my family, and just as I was about to leave, there was a huge commotion outside. All of my neighbors were rushing to the terrace. The sea is boiling, everyone kept shouting in Tamil. This made no sense to me, but apparently the sea had swept in, and it was possible that it was going to flood the streets. My grandmother, who was in her 70s, could not be convinced to go to the terrace like everybody else. The rasam was not done for the day, and the word tsunami meant nothing to her. Indeed, it meant nothing to any of us. It's been 17 years since the Indian Ocean tsunami, but that's still the most significant disaster in my childhood. As I grew up, I experienced earthquakes, floods, cyclones, and other disasters. As I'm sure if you're listening, you have too. Disasters are part and parcel of life now, and it's up to us to be resilient. Welcome to States of Anarchy, a podcast on global affairs and foreign policy. I'm your host, Hamsini Hariharan. Every week, I tackle important questions and themes in international relations, all in the hope of making a little more sense of the world around us. With the COVID 19 pandemic, I think we've all come to realize how unprepared we are to tackle disasters. And this is not unique to the pandemic. Every time a disaster strikes, it catches us unawares. So, when a disaster happens, who are the stakeholders involved from local all the way to international levels? How have responses across the Asia Pacific and in India evolved? How is technology helping us tackle disasters? My guest for today has immense experience in dealing with this. Dr. Anshu Sharma is the co founder of SEEDS, the Sustainable Environment and Ecological Development Society. For the last 26 years, Anshu and SEEDS have been working on enabling community resilience through practical solutions in areas of disaster readiness, response, and rehabilitation. Anshu has coordinated community based action projects, trained practitioners, led interagency efforts, and conducted research. He's also served as an advisor and consultant to numerous governments, nonprofits, the United Nations, and funding agencies. We're going to get into the conversation with Anshu, but after a super short break where we hear from IVM podcasts.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Would like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, CED. We really do appreciate your support. We have a new show on the network. It's called The Fighting Goat. And if you love fighting sports, tune in every Wednesday with hosts Arjun and Somesh. They also featured, by the way, on Cyrus Says this week, where the three fitness freaks bonded over their love for TV sports and sports in general. Tune in to This Round Is On Me, where Gauri celebrated her 25th anniversary with Kavita Rajwade, who is my co-founder at the IVM Podcast Network. They give us details about how this show was curated, and they talk about podcasts in general. On The Habit Coach, Ashton highlighted our addiction to screens, how we are glued to either a big laptop screen or a small mobile screen all day. He shared some tips on how to rectify this unhealthy lifestyle. On All Things Policy, Anirudh Kanisetti spoke to Pratik Vakre and Rohan Sheth about the new internet guidelines that were issued by the Government of India recently, and their impact on content creators and platforms. On the Filter Coffee podcast, Karthik invited Vivek Ram, who is a celebrated animation artist. They chatted about his stint with animation and starting his own studio called Vanar Sena, bringing to life stories from ancient India and his scriptures with animation as his vehicle. We had Dhanya Rajendran, the editor of the News Minute, on the Note with Maruk Inayat. It was a deep dive into the digital newsroom and the upkeep of truth in a fake news pandemic. And with that, let's get you back to your show.
Anshu, welcome to States of Anarchy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Hamsini. A great pleasure being here with you.
You know, whenever I think about climate change, one of the first things that come into my mind is natural disasters. Just this year, for example, we've already had one in Uttarakhand. We've seen sort of the power outage all the way in Texas. But really specifically, when you think about the Asia Pacific region, how do you see disaster response evolve over the last 20 or odd years?
So I think I can immediately think of two very different but aligned tracks on which the world around us has changed in the last 20 years. One, as you asked, has been around the disaster response part. And in this region, I think there's been a phenomenal change for the better in these last 20 years, where earlier we used to be just in a series of knee jerk responses to disasters as they occurred. A lot more preparedness has gone into that. We are way more organized. In some parts, we are also better resourced, but I think more important is that in our minds, in our mindsets, we know what broadly to anticipate. We are better positioned to absorb a shock as it happens and be able to respond. And this is a shift that has happened also in a much larger global context, where earlier this region was largely a recipient of aid. So, whenever there was a major disaster, a cyclone in one of our countries in South Asia or Southeast Asia, the headline would be how the rest of the world is extending support, and the poor are recipients of that support. And a major shift that has happened in these last 20 years is that now we are able to respond far better. Countries in the region are able to help each other far more. And a far more localized thinking has emerged on disaster response. We have also, as part of this, started acknowledging the role that local communities play. We know that they are the first responders, and we've done a lot in these last 20-25 years to build their capacities to be able to respond better. So, that recognition also, I think, is a huge thing that has happened. Now, besides this one track of how response has got better and better organized, I think there's another line of discussion that can be taken up on the term that you use on natural disasters. So, in the sector, nowadays, there has been a very strong movement to even stop using the term natural disasters. And the phrase that goes with it is that no disaster is natural. So, even if you take an event like an earthquake, the earthquake is a natural phenomenon. If you happen to be out in the open, it does not really affect you. If you happen to be living in a very safely built and maintained building, it will not affect you. But if you happen to be in a poorly constructed building, then it turns into a disaster. So we count earthquakes, cyclones, floods as natural hazards, but we assume that there is always an element of human intervention that has gone in the wrong direction that turns it into a disaster. In fact, even Charles Richter, after whom the Richter scale was named that measures earthquakes, there's a very famous quote from him where he said that earthquakes don't kill people, buildings do. And as part of the preparedness campaigns that we run with communities and our advocacy work that we do, we always talk about it that don't think of the disaster as something that is God sent that cannot be avoided. The event is God sent. The damage and the life loss is certainly avoidable through your actions.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting way to look at it. I completely agree. I like the distinction that you're making between natural hazards and disasters in that sense. And I remember even with the Kerala floods a couple of years ago, with the Chennai floods that happen every year, because I'm from the south, I think, there's always emphasis on, oh, look, there are all of these buildings that were built on land that used to be lakes or rivers. And obviously, it's going to flood every time it rains. So I completely agree with that point. And, on one hand, there is sort of like more development, there are more disasters, and thus people are getting more used to maybe responding to them. Um, would you say that there was sort of a watershed moment in disaster management in the last 20 years, like the tsunami that happened in maybe 2004, was it?
Yeah.
Or is there a watershed moment in that sense? Or is this just recurring disasters and hazards that happen every year?
I would say it's a bit of both. There has been incremental learning, reflection, and improvement of systems. But if we talk of watersheds, then yes, certainly. I think there were a couple of them. Uh, there was the 2001 Gujarat earthquake that happened in India, which was international headlines made out of that. And the response was on record. It was one of the best responses to a major disaster in this part of the world, in terms of how agencies collaborated, how the local community, came up and played their role, and how with efficiency and speed, recovery programs could be put in place. So that was right at the beginning of, if we look at this 20-year period. And then, as you rightly remembered, the 2004, it was the 26th of December 2004, when the Indian Ocean tsunami struck a number of countries. That was a watershed in a number of ways. Firstly, it highlighted the fact that disasters nowadays are way more transboundary than we have, thought them to be or prepared for them to be. And countries need to work together. The region needs to work together for that. And out of that came this whole initiative on, monitoring and preparing for tsunamis collaboratively across the Indian Ocean rim. And that was something big that happened. A very key term that has been used since then came out of the tsunami experience, where Bill Clinton, who was a kind of an ambassador to the regional tsunami recovery program, said that we must not just build back, we must build back better. Right? And this BBB, build back better, actually became a very formal phrase that is now used extensively in the sector. That disasters also become an opportunity to eliminate or reduce future risks. So when you are recovering, make sure that you don't try to go back to where you were before the disaster, but you try to be better than that and beat the next one. And I think in the same line, in October 2005, there was an earthquake in Kashmir, which impacted both the Pakistan and the Indian sides of Kashmir. And once again, the impact was huge. And we realized that the need to collaborate on such matters across boundaries is immense. And that was, again, the foundation of a number of regional dialogues, international dialogues that started happening. And on the preparedness side, the one very big watershed I would like to highlight was, well, it sounds a little dull. It was actually a conference. It was the World Conference on Disasters in Kobe, in Japan, in the year 2005. So every 10 years, this kind of a conference happens where all the member states of the UN converge and they discuss and they deliberate, and they come out with a declaration. This actually started in the early 90s. The 90s was declared as the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction. So natural disaster was a mainstream term at that time. It was during the decade that a lot of conversations happened around it. And I remember there were campaigns, there were international disaster days that were celebrated, second Wednesday of October. And a major theme used to be disaster prevention. And partly then, at some point, people started saying that, look, you can't prevent a disaster. You can reduce it to the extent possible. It could be an idealistic goal, but it's not a realistic goal that we will prevent all disasters from happening. What you have to do is try to bring to zero the avoidable deaths that happen and the losses that happen. So all of this was happening now. The interesting piece was how terminology changed, and this was a very new discipline. It literally became a discipline since then, because now you have so many degree courses, undergrad and graduate degree courses. People see this as a career option. A lot of youngsters come in and work, with agencies working in this field. So as it was developing as a discipline, the terminology evolved really fast. So around this time, around 2000, 2004, we said that, okay, prevention is not possible. We need to manage stuff. We need to reduce things. We said natural disasters is not a great term. We should talk about naturally triggered disasters, and we should acknowledge that we always have a role which we need to reduce. And so from prevention and natural disasters, we moved to started talking about disaster preparedness and mitigation. Right? So mitigation would literally mean a set of actions that would reduce the possibility of the disaster happening. And to give you an example, if in houses you start using fire retardant material, you don't use so much timber, you don't put flammable stuff, then you are reducing the possibility of a fire breaking out. And that would be mitigation. But on the other side, we said, since you can't completely prevent, you also need to do preparedness. And preparedness assumes that the event will happen and then you will respond quickly. So on the other hand, then, in the case of fires, installation of a fire extinguisher is a preparedness action. It assumes that the fire will happen and then you will respond. The availability of a first aid kit is a preparedness action. It assumes that someone will get injured, but we will save the life from being lost or the injury becoming grave by responding quickly, giving first aid, getting the person, to the right facility. So that's the change that was happening. And then in 2005, the World Conference happened on disaster management in Kobe and came out with a very, very prominent international declaration called the Hyogo Framework for Action. Hyogo is the prefecture, the state where Kobe is located in Japan. And the Hyogo Framework for Action came out with terminology that we still live with and we are very convinced about. It said we need to reduce risk. It's simple. Everybody can understand. Let's not talk about prevention and natural or technological. Let's just say risk reduction is a goal. And then it broke down risk reduction into 5 key priority areas, which also were very simple to understand. It said that firstly, you need to set up a good governance system. You need to, and that's a risk governance system. And that helps you say that reducing risk or responding to disasters is not just the job of governments. It is everybody's responsibility, right? You are careful when your child is crossing the road. You teach your child how to safely cross the road. You don't wait for the government to come and save your child, right? And mind you, in India, we lose 150,000 lives to road accidents every year. That's more than all the disasters put together. So it is, if you do away with technical definitions, road accidents is a huge disaster for us. So in the same spirit, there is a role that everybody needs to play. So individuals have a role, schools have a role, offices have a role, communities and neighborhoods, RWAs, resident welfare associations have a role, city municipalities have a role, and then upwards others have a role. The media has a role, the private sector has a role, even small shops and trader associations in a community have a role. So governance became one thing, and how to break that down and make sure that every individual has a role. The second priority in the Hyogo framework talked about the role of science and technology. How do you improve early warnings? How do you make sure that people understand these warnings? The third priority talked about the role of education. And very interestingly, it also talked about education on what's local and traditional wisdom. What your grandmom used to say about, the clouds are looking like this, so it might rain tonight. Or if there's something that she observes in nature around her, how that's a precursor. That's often, there was a time when with the onslaught of media and international stuff coming at us, we started all writing that off as complete old woman's tales. But there's stuff there. There's the research that shows that traditional wisdom is important, and we can talk about how the tribal communities in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, who people thought would be completely wiped out when the tsunami happened, they came out unscathed, while a lot of the modern development, so-called modern development, was badly ravaged. And that shows that there is inherent traditional wisdom in communities to deal with disasters. So we spoke about that. The fourth priority of the Hyogo framework talked about underlying risks, how climate change is one factor, which is, we still have a slightly fuzzy understanding of how it directly relates with disasters, but we do realize it's playing a role. Poverty plays a huge role in disaster vulnerability and how people are impacted and how they're able to recover from disaster. So these kind of underlying risks. And finally, it talked about the disaster preparedness. That despite all efforts of reducing risk, you will still have some impact. And how do you prepare for that? How do you even prepare to build back better? That's a later addition that was added. So in a nutshell, then what was happening through experiences on the ground, but then these kind of the powers converging and talking about things. And then in the Asia Pacific region, we started having these series of Asian ministerial conferences. Every 2 years, the ministers responsible in Asian countries for disasters, they meet, and they continue to do that. And that becomes, so these became platforms where conversation started getting people together. They started convening people where a lot of larger change could be talked about. Anthony?
Yeah, no, this is such a great way to just sort of think about disasters. I would actually contest that conferences are not at all boring, because I personally, if you get past the jargon, think that exchange of ideas is always useful. Um, but it also makes me wonder. You've mentioned a huge gamut of things that came through with the Hyogo framework. But whenever a disaster happens, you have multiple stakeholders, and many of whom you've mentioned through this, right? You have right from the local levels, you have NGOs, all the way to the international level. So, what would essentially be, how would a disaster response work?
So, as you rightly say, there's so many players, and somehow when you think of a major disaster in the past, what you recollect is news headlines that you were seeing on television, and you think of, oh, those sniffer dogs and the men in the red jackets who flew in from somewhere, and there's a field hospital that came, and there were rescuers in helicopters and stuff like that, right? So the immediate attention and the way we have been kind of primed to think is that there is something very large that happens at the higher level, and then it filters down, and there's help that goes down to people. In real life, if you look at the percentage of people or lives that are impacted by these very large scale and very highly visible interventions, vis-a-vis the ones that get impacted through very local but very widespread interventions of people helping each other, neighbors coming out, local authorities doing stuff, which often does not get captured in visuals and headlines. The reality is so much skewed towards local communities and governments that the figures can be very shocking. We were once doing a back of the envelope, calculation to see the ratio between international support and what's done locally. And the international support was way below 5% of what actually happened in a major disaster. So, not to undermine the international support, it's really important because it comes and it fills gaps where there are huge ones. That's where the hotspots are. But if you look at the larger picture, then what we believe needs to be done and is being done gradually is that you turn this whole story upside down. Instead of starting with the international support and then national and then going down to local, let's, as a headline, put the people in the center. You and your neighbor are the most important disaster managers in your life, and they will always be, right? That's where you should invest your thoughts and your energy and have some conversations and put some plans together. There's no power of the world that can do what you yourself and your neighbor can do when something will go wrong. And then you start building from there, and then your resident welfare association is really important. And then the people around that are important. Then your municipality and your councillor is really important. Then your state or your prefecture is important. Your national government is really important because they pull the resources together to make things happen where there are gaps. Finally, the international, community is important, critically important, but in this order is what we would say. So that's how we try to map the stakeholders, and we always try to put the people first and the people in the center. Anthony?
I like the approach that puts people at the center. I think because if you work the other way around, I guess it's not as effective. And whenever I think about even last year when Chennai was facing a storm, it was basically, your neighbors and you who are trying to figure out what to do because you all sort of live together in the same situation. So I completely understand sort of putting people at the center in that sense. Um, and I think, going back to what you said about, these Asian ministerial conferences and lots of exchanges in the 2000s, countries across the world are now, recognizing and actively trying to reduce disaster risk. How do you see India's policy particularly changing?
So in these last 20 years, I think India has done phenomenal work on this theme. 20 years ago, the nodal ministry for disaster management in India was the Ministry of Agriculture.
Oh,
when the
wow.
Gujarat earthquake happened. And this was so because for decades before that, and from the time when the British were setting up systems here, the biggest worry used to be famines. And so officially, we used to have something called a famine relief code. And to run that relief code, since it was about food and hunger, the agriculture ministry was the most suited one. So in 2001, as a country, we were responding to one of the biggest earthquakes we had ever seen. And it was the Ministry of Agriculture that was responsible for that, with buildings collapsing and conversations happening around base isolation technology for rebuilding a hospital and immediate medical support. And I must say they did a great job, no doubt about that. But the realization was that we need to be better organized. So in the 4 or 5 years after that, we got a National Disaster Management Act. We got a National Disaster Management Authority chaired by the Prime Minister. The nodal ministry as a charge was moved from the Ministry of Agriculture to Ministry of Home Affairs. A lot more prominence given, a lot more people deployed to it. 24/7 control room set up. Many of our states started getting their own act together. The state disaster management authorities came into place. Down to the district level, the authorities were set up, plans were prepared. We got a national disaster management policy. We got a national disaster management plan, which today it's been acclaimed as one of the most progressive in the world, as it's completely aligned to the global framework that we spoke about, which is now called the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. So two things happened. One was getting ourselves organized internally, and the second thing that happened was making sure that we plug into the international conversation and systems coming up, so that we firstly can be part of a larger system. The disaster system, as it operates naturally, does not see national boundaries, so we can address that. And also we can play a constructive, collaborative role in that. And the most recent development has been the establishment of an institution called the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, or CDRI, initiated and led by the Indian government, but it has over 20 countries, most prominent countries globally and from the South Asia region, who are members of it. The UN system is a part of it, and we're trying to figure out how not just high-end infrastructure like of course airports and rails and railways and bridges and stuff like that, but also very community level infrastructure that you would often write off as informal sector things. They become resilient to help people perform better in disasters and climate change context. So literally earlier this week there was a event organized by the CDRI Secretariat to engage with civil society players and the UN system to see how that space can actually be activated and play a useful role. So I think there's been phenomenal progress in the last 20 years. We I think we are already seeing good results of that. I can tell you from personal experiences that one of the major programs that started about 18 years ago in India was a school safety program. So that unless you start teaching kids from a very young age, you can't really make a mindset shift at a national level to be prepared for disasters and be reducing that. So I remember we used to go around and should talk about earthquakes happen and things happen. And earlier when we used to get kids to draw earthquakes, I distinctly remember drawings where there would be a bull who's holding the earth on his horns, and he would shake his head and the earth. So that was the real conversation happening in communities on how earthquakes happen.
Mm.
So there was so much of mythology. There's so much of uh, also fatalism, that if God wishes to kill us through an earthquake, there's nothing you can do about it. That's how it is. And now, if I tell you of more recent experiences, we literally go to a school, a young kid standing there, and we sitting there and we talk about earthquakes. We show a few very child-friendly slides on how the tectonic plates are moving. And a little hand goes up, and this kid says that, okay, this is all fine, but can you tell us about base isolation technology? Standing there, oh God, where is this coming from? So what it shows is that the level of the conversation has really moved up. That kids are far more conscious about stuff than my generation used to be, and I think that's the most powerful indicator that the society is better geared than it was. Of course, we do have a long way to go, and I'm sure we will cover that distance well. But these are small indicators of how things are getting better, and I think we will be seeing results of this even in disasters as we will face them in times to come. Anthony?
Yeah, I'm really glad that one, there is sort of a good sort of increase in awareness and knowledge among younger people. And I think, it's really good to hear that the Indian government's policies on disaster management are one of the most progressive in the world. And it just makes me wonder why, in the sense that the Indian government does certain things really well, but it's also slow on many other things, as we know. It's a small organization with a huge mandate at the end of the day. So why does the Indian government do disaster reduction or disaster management so well?
Okay, I think probably we are not in the right space to say whether it does it really well or it doesn't.
Okay.
I think every performance has its strengths and areas of improvement. One thing we need to be conscious of is that constitutionally there is uh, sort of the mandate is awarded to different levels of governance in a very clear way, right? So there are aspects of disaster management and disaster response and recovery, including issues, anything around land, which in the Indian constitution is a state subject. It is not a central subject. So in some ways, as I was earlier saying, when you turn the filter upside down and you start from communities and then you start moving up, the most prominent role that in the governance system that is played on disasters is played by the district authorities, because that's where there is no distinction between preparedness and response. There is no distinction between climate change and disasters. Everything turns down into what the community is facing right now and what their needs are and how do you respond to that, right? So they are at the executive level, unless the district is empowered and has the resources to do what it needs to do, no matter how good your policies or your acts or your plans, you will not see them translating into action.
Mm-hmm.
When you move upwards from there, then comes the state. Now, every state is governed in a slightly different way. There are different political alignments, there are different immediate concerns of the state, there are different levels of resources that are available to a state government. There are different levels of complexity in the exposure to hazards and the vulnerability of the people, and so on. So, how a state performs is then crucially important for execution to happen and to be carried out by the district. So, the national government's role can be these two things that we spoke about today. One is to see the larger context and plug into what's happening internationally. And secondly, to set the right frameworks for action to happen at the state, district, and community levels. Right? Now, not just for disasters, but for a lot of other things, I think we read it and we see it that there is a gap between what's on paper and what gets implemented on the ground. And that happens in the translation of policies, of laws. It happens across laws, it happens across different thematic areas. And I think that's an area where we need to focus, and that's an area where efforts need to continue to see that whatever good stuff we've put in place, whatever acclaim we've got in terms of our national policy and plan and act, gets translated into saving lives. Again, to give you an example, even if you Google today, you find that the way Orissa has been evacuating its people for cyclone warnings is talked about internationally, right? It was when it happened a couple of years ago. That was global news. It was on CNN and BBC on 1 million people being evacuated like overnight and losses being really low. It is the same Orissa that in 1999, when a super cyclone happened and somewhere close to 20,000 people died, the state did not have the wherewithal to even make a telephone call to New Delhi to say that, hey, we've been hit by a cyclone and we're in a bad shape, because all communication lines were down. There was nothing that could move. And the first call that was made from Bhubaneswar to Delhi was enabled by a team from Andhra Pradesh, because the cyclone was first heading towards Andhra. Andhra had seen a major cyclone in 1977, learnt its lessons from there, really ramped up its preparedness systems, ham radios in every coastal district, mobile teams, community disaster teams. Every village had a trained task force. And they had learned that when a cyclone happens, your highways get blocked because of falling trees. So that's a big issue and people can't remove them. So they had these mobile teams that were moving with chainsaws that can clear roads like super fast. And so they were, as the cyclone track started moving northwards, the teams kept moving on the highway. The cyclone tracks, eventually the Met Department said, no, it's not coming to Andhra, it's going to Orissa. And the state took a call that no, then we must extend help. We've seen this, and the teams will move into Orissa and keep moving, right? So they were literally chasing the storm, and when it hit, they were clearing the roads. They reached the chief minister's office. They had a mobile radio. They enabled a call to happen. I mean, it was just a call, but there's a huge story behind that call, right? So, so here's a state that learned from its disaster. A neighboring state did not learn because it did not see and experience that. And this state came across and enabled a recovery. And then Orissa geared up from there. It was one of the first state disaster management authority. They call it the Orissa State Mitigation Authority, OSTMA. And they really ramped up their systems well before the Indian Disaster Management Act came about, well before the Indian National Plan came about for disasters. And here's a state that today, of course, with now here's a collaboration of the Indian Meteorological Department is a central government body that is now able to give a highly accurate 10-day forecast of a cyclone. And here's a state that has gone through that bad experience, ramped up its resources, and is able to go in and pull 1 million people out literally overnight. They've identified what public buildings they will be housed in. They've identified what vehicles will be brought in to transport them. They've identified that people who are not willing to move, how they will be persuaded. They've identified how food will be organized, how mobile toilets will be organized, and so on, right? Now, people may say that, oh, it was not perfect. The pregnant women had a lot of problem in that particular cyclone shelter, or some people were brutally forced to evacuate. But the fact is that life loss has come down to a tiny fraction of what it was 20 years ago. Yeah. So what I'm also trying to underscore here is that you can't put the onus on the national government or a state government or a district collector or a civil society group or groups per se. It has to happen together. What we are talking today in terms of acclaim and what has happened well is the frameworks have happened well. And there are pieces of good news on how it's translating into good action on the ground. There's a lot of ground to be covered to make sure that every disaster in every state in the future will meet this kind of a response and communities will be better prepared to face that. Hamsini.
Yes, that is the hope. And it makes me wonder, the more we develop as a nation, the more climate change continues to affect all of our lives, India is extremely vulnerable to disasters, right? We're surrounded by water on three sides. We have the Himalayas in the north, and that makes us really prone to disasters. The more that climate change affects our world. So, how do you see this affecting the Indian response? Is it in terms of, I don't know, frequency, perhaps?
Okay, so so again, let's take the problem part of it, and then let's take the solution part of it. The problem is that there's bad stuff waiting for us in the future, right? Let's just call it that. And very often we can't even figure out what that is. So when work was happening on the first draft of the National Disaster Management Plan, this was into the year 2000, there was a list drawn up. There were more than 30 natural hazards that were natural and technological hazards that were identified that can turn into disasters that we need to be prepared for, right? All of this was done, signed off, printed, and in I think 3 years after that report, one fine morning, there's news on television that in the coastal roads of Chennai and these slums in Chennai, there's a lot of water that has come in the morning. There is no cyclone, but there is a storm surge kind of water that is coming. What the hell is this? And then somebody said tsunami. And no, but what is a tsunami? Never heard of this word. It's not there in any of our documentation. It's not in our draft plan, right? So there were stories. People assume tsunamis happen in Japan and somewhere the rest of the world. They don't happen to us, but it did occur, right? Similarly, if you take the case of the pandemic last year, pandemics have been written about, but were we prepared for what happened? And to be honest, even those of us who worked for decades in the area of disaster management were not prepared for this kind of a unfolding of events. So now on the solution side, why I narrate these two incidents is that we need to improve our ability to anticipate what can go wrong and then prepare for it, and then leave some buffer, because there are some unknowns that we don't even know that we don't know, and they will happen, right? So that's where the vulnerability bit is worrying, and it requires action, that there's a worsening of some trends in the future. There are some events which will not follow trends. So a tendency and a scientific approach has been, you look at trends, how it happened since 1901, and you're plotting things. So, okay, this is going to get worse, this is going to get better. But what climate change is telling us, and climate change is, this term is very misleading. People assume that it's changing on a known trajectory. The problem is it's climate variability. It's spiking, and you don't know what will happen. You don't know whether it's going to be a super hot summer or it's going to be a super cold winter this year. You don't know whether the rainfall will be more or less, or will it be normal as per the average of the year, but it will happen at the wrong time. Or instead of happening over 50 days, it will happen over 5 days and will completely flood you out. And then there'll be a drought after that. So it's the variability that is worrying. We don't know what we are heading into. And so you need to constantly get better at anticipating. And you need to constantly remind yourself that you can't anticipate everything. Something else will happen. And how do you prepare for that? Right. So that changes our entire way of working on how we think of, how we analyze, and how we plan for disaster. And in this context, I think then the only thing I would add is, uh, the way you spoke about so many different kinds of geoclimatic settings, as we call them. There's the coastal areas, there's a arid region, there is the Himalayas, there is the river basins, and there's a mix. So there are states which are at the same time having droughts in some districts and floods in some other districts. So I think this complexity makes us very unique. India is one of those few countries which sees over 35 odd kinds of hazards. I think except for active volcanoes, we have almost everything. And that's the complexity of the problem. And that's why we need a far more open-minded and a futuristic approach that on one hand takes the traditional wisdom that we spoke about today, but then also takes and makes use of the most cutting edge modern technology to make sure that we are covering all the bases and being as safe as possible.
And, Anshu, that makes me wonder, as things get more uncertain, as there's more variability, as you've said, uh, a lot of people talk about, artificial intelligence has become this new buzzword in everything that we do these days. In my eyes, when I think about sort of like technology and disaster response or disaster management, I just think about how in the early 2000s, SMSs were just a new way of mobilizing people and sending out information that this thing was happening, right? And so, how would you see sort of the role of technology and maybe in the future AI play out?
So I'm a great believer of technology. And I think you were very right in saying that AI is coming into everything we do. Half the time, we don't even realize that it's coming in, right? So even right now on this call, when you and I speak, the yellow box around our pictures switches. And like a couple of years ago, like even a year ago, when you would cut each other's sound out, it doesn't happen so often anymore. There's AI at work right now to make this call happen. When you are driving with Google Maps telling you the shortest route, and then suddenly midway it says, no, there's a shorter route available now because the traffic conditions have changed. There is AI at work for you there. When you start typing for, searching something and pops up something that you've just been thinking of, you haven't even typed the first word or half of it, that's AI at work. That's so it's already there. It's running quite a bit of our lives already, but in the context of disaster, I think it has a phenomenal role to play. We are only beginning to scrape that surface right now when we are talking about hyperlocal warnings for disaster. So there's some work that's happening. We are also part of, which is on artificial intelligence for humanitarian action, where right now, so the communities that we speak about, let's say Orissa, or let's say now the heat wave is, just around the corner for Vidarbha and the central Indian region. Even with the massive improvement that technology has seen with satellite imagery and huge computing power that the Met Department has with it, and their warnings are pretty accurate now, you still find a huge gap between what's being given as a warning and what communities are able to absorb and understand and be able to act upon. So if there's water being released on a river upstream from where you're sitting right now, and there's a warning that comes, it'll tell you that the headline says 200,000 cusecs of water being released from a dam upstream. Right? A cusec means a cubic foot per second. So it's 28 liters per second. Multiply that by 200,000 is being released from a dam 100 kilometers upstream from. What does that mean? So what do I do? Or you get a cyclone warning, that a category 2 cyclone, or even wind speeds of 150 odd kilometers is going to strike 3 days from now. So what do I do? Uh, that's where AI, just the way on your, and the power is right now there on your phone. So it's going to be a matter of months or at most a year or two when you'll be able to pull your phone out and you'll get a warning that where you're sitting right now in your house, there will be 2 feet of water 36 hours from now. Your house is made of uh, brick and mortar, but it is old and there was some mud mortar at that time. So there is a high risk of partial failure. So you need to evacuate, and your options are one, two, three. This is the closest public building. This is your closest relative. This is the route to take, and so on. It's not, it sounds like science fiction, but this is currently being tested and deployed. So I think AI is going to be huge for saving lives, for immediate disaster avoidance. I think we do have a much longer way to go in terms of how we will be able to use this knowledge to make people safer. So we spoke about buildings killing people and not earthquakes. Now, to fix that, you need to fix buildings. You need to fix millions of buildings, and that costs money, right? And a lot of this is private building. It has to be private money. It has to be the will to spend that money to make life safer. So it's complex, but then it goes round in circles, and then I come back to where you need to improve the understanding of risk. If people are willing to do so much to make a good future for their children, they will be willing to act and even invest resources to make lives safer for their families and their children. For those of us who work in this domain, and those of you in the media who communicate with people far better than the science side, we need to improve our disaster communication and disaster diplomacy to make sure that the people who need to act, including every single individual, understand what their risk is and why they need to act and what they need to do.
Fair enough. I completely agree with that sentiment. And it also makes me wonder about sort of like the flip side of technology, having technology at our fingertips in that sense, which is the problem of, misinformation. And I think now more than ever, if a disaster strikes, then there's a lot of panic. I think recently we've seen like videos of other disasters are being shown as current disasters and so on. So I would assume that that would be a huge challenge in now disaster mitigation, right? Just not getting people to panic. What is your approach on sort of misinformation and fake news?
So I agree. I think it is one of the biggest concerns these days because there's so much of, you know, the wrong stuff that floats around. But then I read somewhere that when the first printing press came about, there was a hue and cry that, oh my God, now all kinds of satanic stuff and bad stuff will be printed and it will just so easily go out to people, which it did. Bad stuff was printed, right? So any communication channel will carry both things. Any technological platform or ability like AI will do both things. It is a tool in the hands of those who want to play mischief, and it is a tool in the hands of those who want to do good stuff, just like any case of arms and ammunitions too. The cops also have guns and the robbers also have guns. But I think this is where we need to organize as society. And I already see a lot of that happening, the fact checking stuff that has started happening, the conversations in the media group. Some of them are more proactive than others as of date, but I do strongly believe that very soon we will see all of them, falling in line, taking proactive action also, and systems coming into play. So while it is a huge concern right now, I think in the long run, this is a transitional phase we will get over. And I do very, very strongly believe that technology will play a far more positive role than what damage it will do in the hands of a few mischievous people whom I do believe we'll be able to control.
Okay, that's good to know. Now, this might seem like a really large question, But I'm just wondering, you worked in this space for a while, your organization's obviously doing wonderful work. From your own experience with disaster relief, what are sort of large takeaways that you have come out with?
Yeah, that indeed is a large question. I think parts of this, as I have been touching upon, there's two or three very key things that I have taken away from my experiences, which I would at least urge those who are considering working in this sector, or maybe even those who are just living their lives. And since disaster preparedness is a life skill, it's important for everyone. One is that everyone has a very critical role to play. It is not somebody's business. Disaster management is everybody's business. And unless we can get that clearly understood and imbibed in our actions, we'll always have some people slipping through gaps. I think that's the key. People are in the center. Every individual is important. And the second piece is that there is always an inherent capacity. uh, we haven't parachuted on this earth right now. There are generations have learned what their risks were. They have learned to live with those risks. They have learned to mitigate the adverse impacts of whatever's happening around them. We should not believe that it's a new thing we need to do and we need to ape what other developed countries have done and we need models to be imported. There's a lot that's happening, that has been happening in our communities, in our societies, in our countries, in our region. I do, very strongly believe with evidence that the Southeast Asian region is the richest in terms of traditional wisdom on living with risk. We have seen risk for centuries like no other community has. We are one of the densest populated parts of the world, and we've known how to deal with this. We need to get that in order to some better degree, and we need to make use of good technology to improve our levels of performance in that. And I do believe that local innovations, frugal innovations, and local action are the way forward. And very lastly, I did mention a bit about school safety. I think if there's one thing that we have to invest in, it should be making our children conscious of how to live with risk. That's going to make transformational change. No documents, no new technology deployment this year is going to do that for us.
Fair enough. And this is my last question for you. And it's something that I ask all of my guests. What books or resources would you recommend for someone who wants to know more about disaster response or reduction?
Okay, so once again, with changing technology, this is becoming a more and more difficult question to answer because the world changes so fast that books often become dated even before they're out. But it's a science which has a very stable traditional part to it, and there's a very fast evolving part to it. So, to your listeners, I would recommend a book titled Disaster Risk Management in Asia and the Pacific. It's a book that came out from the Asian Development Bank Institute a few years ago. It was edited by Professor Ian Davis, who's been a guru to me and almost everyone who works in the sector of disaster management. It's a fundamental book that tells you, and it's a book focused on this region. So it gives you where we've come from, where we are, how the state of the art is constantly evolving nowadays. Besides this, I would recommend some dynamic risks. I would urge you to look at the online resources, including the website of the Asian Disaster Reduction and Response Network, the ADRRN. The website is adrrn.net. ADRRN is a network of civil society groups across the Asian region that work on disaster reduction and response. And this is where you find a lot of the stuff which talks about people being in the center and response being localized. Parallel to this is the Asian Disaster Reduction Center, the ADRC, which is based in Japan. They also run a website called adrc.asia. And this is where you find resources on how intergovernmental efforts are coming together on this. There are volunteering and internship opportunities that come out from both these sites. So anyone who's interested to do more, get experience, can also look at that. And these work. And I did mention in my conversation with you also about the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which sounds very hardware oriented, but is evolving into a lot more stuff that is happening both on the software side and the hardware side, infrastructure side, including civil society engagement for this. The CDRI website is cdri.world. Number of resources emerging from there of late. There's a big international conference coming up in a couple of weeks that will be visible on their platforms. So I would urge your listeners to take a peek there if you have an interest in this sector.
All right. Thank you so much, Anshu. Thank you for coming on the show and for sort of enlightening us on this really important aspect of our lives.
Thank you. A great pleasure being here.
That brings us to the end of this episode of States of Anarchy. Anshu's recommendations are in the episode bio. It's always important to prepare for disasters, so do check those out. If you have questions or comments about disasters in particular, or foreign policy in general, then you can send them across to me. On next week's episode, I'll answer listener questions about international relations. So you can email me at ivmstatesofanarchy@gmail.com or slide into my DMs on Instagram at States of Anarchy or Twitter at HamsiniH. If you want to show us some love, send this episode to someone who you think may enjoy it. You can also leave us a rating on iTunes or your favorite podcast app. You can listen to States of Anarchy on Google, Spotify, iTunes, Castbox, or whatever you're using right now. We'll be back next week.
Hi, I'm Zarina Poonawalla, host of the Empowering Series podcast on the IVM network. I happen to be a peak performance coach and leadership coach by profession, and I'm here to share with you productivity tools, life-altering techniques, and real-life hacks to help you achieve your maximum potential in everything you do, your relationships, professions, careers. So tune in every Monday to unleash your inner power. Be safe, be well, be empowered.
Feeling overwhelmed, anxious, struggling with too many obstacles, don't know where your life is headed? Well, if you are dealing with one or all of these, tune into the Positively Unlimited podcast, because in each episode, I share a life lesson, a life hack, a pro tip that can help you get your life back on track. All episodes are available on the IBM website, IBM Podcast app, or wherever it is that you get your podcast from.